So I'd like to tell you a story, and you'll forgive me for trying to squint at a very small number of numbers on my phone, but I want to tell you the story of Zambia and South Korea. In 1960, which is not even a lifetime, Zambia was slightly ahead of South Korea at $229 per capita GDP. South Korea was at $155 per capita GDP. This is just in 1960. Every time I've shared this talk, there have always been people in the room who have been born earlier than 1960. I suspect that it's still the case today. If you fast forward to 2015, what you find is that South Korea's GDP is 20 times, a multiple of 20. Not 20% more, 20 times. Their GDP per capita is just on $27,000, and Zambia's is on $1,300. Single lifetime, same starting block, single generation. Now, I prepared a lot of graphs for you because I'm told that financial people are a disbelieving type. When they're finished with their work, they need other people to come in and check that their work has been done the way that they said it had been done. I fear I'm going to have to throw myself at the mercy of the auditors in the room. But most people then say that I'm cherry picking, that this is one once-off anomaly, and that this is a story that could have happened anywhere. But just one swallow doesn't make a summer. So we look a little deeper in this. And there is a similar graph of people who start at exactly the same place and who have a higher achievement rate in the same period from 1960 to 2015, higher than South Korea's. Those countries are Singapore, Hong Kong, sorry, you'll have to forgive me just a line, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Italy, Germany, and a host of others. All of these, in the space of 1960 to 2015, were able to multiply their GDP per capita at a rate higher than South Korea's. The story goes further because when you look at this, people see an upward trending graph every time. This upward trending graph makes people believe that this upward trend is the natural consequence of existence, that as long as everyone is on Earth, everyone's graph would look the same. For contrast, what I then do is I show South Africa, Nigeria, and Mexico to show that there is a divergent gap between those that see a soaring graph and countries like ours that generally flatline and go sideways. The implication is that type of growth is not the natural consequence of existence. The countries that I mentioned are very interesting, and you'll see that I always present to disbelieving people because they say to me, hang on a minute, all of these examples we buy, we get it. We have no problem believing them. But the question that lingers is, can a black African country with a black African government get there? Because I don't see that on your graph. And for that, I'd like to spend a little bit of time, a little bit of a digression. Now, forgive me for doing this, but you'll find that this is probably just a reflection of my own social circle. This question, when I discuss it amongst people who are black, whenever they see just something that's been written in the paper, they go, in Zulu or Sesotho or something, what do you expect from a black person? The nice thing about black people in this sense is that they feel free. I'm not sure that they should be, but they feel free to overtly share the racist view to everyone in public. Yeah. My social circle, people who are not black by race, don't have the same freedom. I've never heard them express the same sentiment. But it makes sense to me that if black colleagues, black friends express the sentiment, it must be a lingering question in those races as well. I mean, is this even possible? Now, I'd like you to imagine, if you will, the Great Wall of China. Has everyone seen a visual of it? Anybody not seen a visual of it here? Okay. 8,000 kilometers of this incredibly wide wall, something that is architectural marvel the world over. This is something that's visited and is on the bucket list of almost all travelers in the world. It is a magnificent piece of architecture. However, what's very interesting to me is that if we go to West Africa, there's a small architectural monument, and it's called the Great City of Benin. Has anybody been? It's a very interesting, very, very interesting monument. And if I had the visuals, it would paint the picture, but I would like instead to default to the description that was given by a very eminent person. You'll see that I'll default to the specialist in this area because I don't want to be accused of distorting the truth. This particular specialist is a scientist by the name of Fred Pierce, and he writes for The New Scientist. He writes, and I'm going to prepare a reading that's incredibly tiny, but I'd like you to listen to his words because they'll paint a better picture than I can with his words. He's talking about the walls of the great city of Benin, and I quote, "They extend for some 16,000 kilometers in all, a mosaic of more than 500 interconnected settlement boundaries. They cover 6,500 square kilometers and were all dug by the Idu people. In all, they are 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China and consumed 100 times more material than the Great Pyramid of Cheops. They took an estimated 150 million hours of digging to construct, and they are perhaps the largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet." Who had heard of this largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet before this morning? Anyone? This is a very curious state of affairs. We are alleged that we can see the Great Wall of China from the moon, but something that would be 4 times the size is something that has escaped mention in the world of big data, the internet, Google Earth, Google Maps, SpaceX. We can return rockets and reuse them, and yet we don't know that there is an archaeological phenomenon on this continent 4 times the size of the Great Wall of China. Let's move on a little. Let's stay in West Africa. Has anybody heard of Mansa Musa? He was a Malayan emperor. He ruled from around 1320 to 1337. He comes to continental prominence when he decides, being the Muslim that he is, to take his pilgrimage. He embarks on a Hajj. When he does so, he takes 60,000 people with him in his entourage. 12,000 of them were slaves who had the sole purpose of carrying gold, wielding gold staffs, handling bags and horses. Amongst his party, there were 48,000 others, and 80 camels laden with between 36 and 120 kilograms of gold dust. His 2-year journey is recorded by a multitude of eyewitnesses. Apparently, Mansa Musa was a generous guy. He gave out so much gold on his trip to and from Mecca that it completely collapsed the value of gold in the region for a decade. Never in history has anybody been recorded as being single-handedly able to influence the price of gold. A similar and curious event, because nobody knows much about him. There are so many of these examples, and the reason why it's so difficult for me to summarize the provocations that I have for you this morning is because there are so many examples about the Aksumite naval power that were in the north of Ethiopia. I'm not sure how much you know about the Moors, but the Moors were people from the Maghreb who decided that in 711 they were going to embark on a conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. In all, they conquer much more than half of the Iberian Peninsula. And from 711 until 1492, they are the rulers of the Spanish and Portuguese worlds. In addition to which, they bring with them a number of inventions. They introduce paper to Europe, taking out a very clumsy system. The Muslim outlook had been such that literacy was encouraged for everyone from a very young age. And instead, at the time, the Christian outlook had reserved literacy and learning for a very small clerical class. All of these inventions, there are descriptions of the city of Cordoba under Moorish law, the first city to have street lights, and a whole range of inventions which we don't have time to get into today. The point I'm making is a very simple one. For the people of this African continent, we have been sold the disturbance in the story as the story. Whatever and however we see the problems of colonialism, of slavery, of apartheid, of genocide, of ethnic wars, and any other things, we have been tricked into believing that that is the totality of the African story, when in practice, it is a small disturbance. A disturbance that I'm happy to argue with those of you who are historical is much smaller than the disturbances of other regions. We can talk about the 1,000 years that Europe suffered under an unending series of conflicts. The story that we've chosen to focus on is so minuscule, is such a small disturbance, that it is still a crying shame. I raise this historical digression to make this fundamental point. The question of black governance and black economic prosperity and its ability to operate at the summit of global prosperity, intellect, and influence is not a question we need to answer today, because that has been settled for at least a millennia. A 50-year disturbance has never, and will never cancel it out. The only question that this raises is the Africans in this room. How long are we going to wait to return to the summit of global influence and economic affairs? The second thing that I'd like to raise with you, or the third belief that I'd like to raise with you, is the belief that we have to accept these historical timelines. And this is where a graph would have been really, really helpful. But there is an impressive graph, and if this graph doesn't impress you, I'm not sure that anything will. It's called the Jesus graph. It's a graph that tries to plot GDP all the way until the year 0 AD. Yep. So they're trying to track GDP from the time that Christ was on earth, supposedly, and until the present day. And what you'll find is that if you can imagine something along the line of the Sandton Convention Center that you can't see at the bottom here, then all of a sudden at the 1800s, it jumps up. It is an incredible, incredible juxtaposition of what came before, because that's when the first industrial revolution takes place. What I'm trying to illustrate with that is that there is no reason now that we need to adhere to the timelines of centuries and millennia before. And that is why we can see that in a single generation, not only is it possible for us, but it has been possible for many, many countries around the world. This includes every single country that is on this continent. So I'd like to encourage you, because we have a long way to go and a short time to get there, that you look at the empires of Benin, the Mosi kingdoms, if you look at the Ghanaian empires, if you look at the Oyo, the Moors, Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe. And so you can come to a similar conclusion to the one that I'm trying to convince you of this morning. But there's a third problem. Every single keynote, every single hushed tone talks about the education question. We know the stats incredibly well. We know how low it is that our standards have sunk. We understand just how unprepared these people that we're sending into the workplace are. And while education is incredibly important, I have a series of questions for you. Small country of Vietnam suffered a war lasting 19 years and 6 months. A brutal and devastating war that drew in all of the world's major superpowers, famous for the defeat of even the dominant military power on earth. If you look at the pictures on Google Images, and you look at the carnage and the destruction of Vietnam, what you'll find are a number of children hiding in jungles, hiding in cities, taking shelter from bombings. And you don't need, as soon as you see those visuals, to see, you don't need a report from Malusi to tell you that there was low attendance, low education, poor attendance, and lack of education taking place in Vietnam. The war ends very recently, and one of the things that we find is that Vietnam, a country of double our population, 1/8 of our land mass, practically none of our natural resources, is able to halve poverty from 1990 to 2014. If education was the only way to accomplish this feat, how could Vietnam have done so? I'm not against education. I hope that it comes through that I'm partial to reading a book or two. But one of the things that I can say is that it is not the only and necessary tool that we have to gain economic prosperity. It is possible to do that even without any education at all. 20 years, an entire generation. The one that's doing this economic prosperity that we're seeing that's impressive, with a minuscule amount of our resources, is being undertaken right now with the generation that spent grades 1 to 12 and tertiary education ducking bombs, evading landmines. Surely, it is not beyond our considerable power to go beyond their example. There's a fourth one. This perhaps the most contentious of them all. We have this hope, this belief, that a wonderful moral leadership will take over. And this wonderful morality will free us from wasted millions and billions. And when that is the case, we're all going to enjoy the benefits of prosperity. I'd like to share a story with you. It's one of my personal favorites, but it's a story of a Burkinabe military colonel. He's a famous guy by the name of Thomas Sankara. He takes over the West African nation in 1987. And he is one of the most morally upright, benevolent dictators the world has ever seen. There is no tendency, no hint, no proclivity of corruption in him. Not once. So he kicks off his rulership with a number of things that would make everyone in this room cheer. He comes in and he sells the government fleet of Mercedes-Benzes. He replaces them all with a Renault 5. A Renault 5 was the tiny matchbox that was the cheapest car on sale in Burkina Faso in 1987. He banned all first-class flying. He said no to all foreign aid. He redistributed the land. He planted wheat on the land, gave the country food security. In 3 years, wheat production more than doubled. He was asked one day, why is it that every single government department doesn't have his portrait on the wall, as is the custom in every African country? He said, there's 7 million other Thomas Sankaras. By every measure and by every discipline, he inoculated 2.5 million kids from measles, yellow fever, and other diseases. He stopped female genital mutilation, polygamy, and other issues related to women's oppression. He planted 10 million trees to halt the desertification of the north region of Burkina Faso, named the Sahel. By every single measure, he did everything that we expect of a moral, upright leader. But the economic evidence is interesting. As moral as Thomas Sankara was, and I mean that in the most sincere sense possible, the Burkina Faso economy largely goes sideways. I mean, it's impressive. There is energy, there is intention, there is morality. It is free of all things corrupt. And yet, nothing by way of prosperity. By contrast, I'd like to chat to you about somebody who would make our own president seem like he's just in kindergarten. I don't know what you know about the wonderful character of Silvio Berlusconi. I understand that the premiers of Italy have moved on, but I'm fascinated by Silvio. I'm going to use him for the next, year or two still, because he's just the most colorful character. Italy decided to take account of their own corruption problem. Okay? This was not us inferring it on them. They decided that they're going to take stock. They came to a number of 60 billion euros for the year of 2016. Fully 900 billion rand. I know you're upset about Nkandla, and I don't want to get into that at the moment, but I just need you, please, to take a moment about a corruption problem 900 billion rands in size. They are below below South Africa in the corruption index. Not only has Italy got a systemic corruption problem that is measurable, that government can see is money not going into their coffers, they still have had hundreds of years of socio-economic corruption in the form of the mafia. This is the part that's not accounted for. Nobody's taking stats about when they knock on your door and decide to collect rent, or they convince you of their economic policy by means which the government cannot account for. By every measure, this is a society of incredible corruption. Not me. I didn't come up with the 60 billion. They did. By their own admission, it is a rampant problem. The curious thing about Italy is that they're the 8th largest GDP on earth in nominal terms, 12th in purchasing power parity. It's a curious problem for morality and economic prosperity, isn't it? The upright are poor and the corrupt are rich. Now, let me say this clearly and categorically, is that the lack of corruption is an important social justice issue. It is to be pursued, and it is important. All I'm trying to get you to understand today is that there is no correlation necessarily between morality and economic prosperity. This begs the question, if it's not morality, if it's not education, if it's not the fact that it's impossible, if it's not the fact that it's not impossible for us as a country that is ruled by a predominantly black government, inhabited by a predominantly black population, then what is it? If it's not those things, then what is it? So one of the things that I'd like to do now is try and paint for you this picture that I have in graphs in order to bring home what it is that we need to do. And I want to start off by saying that there is an order, there's a definite sequence, there's a chronology to arriving at economic prosperity. Yeah. How the order in which we do it is very important. And there is a very, very lucrative question that we can ask. That question is, what do other people want or need that we can credibly or competitively deliver? It sounds simple, but let's look a little deeper into it. You see, a country's economic performance can be measured reliably by two factors. How complex are its products, and do they export them? Yeah. How complex are the nation's products? And does that country export them? So let's take a number of practical examples. Let's talk about any large industrialized nation in the world. Let's start with the biggest one, the US. In South Africa, you'll find complex US products like Ford, General Motors, who own Chevy, who own all of those types of things. You'll find Boeing aircraft that are hugely complex. You'll find a whole range of systems, even down to chocolates, even down to confectionery, even down to a number of complex products which have been made using an incredible amount of value that accrues to the United States and that we find here, which is the export link. Does that make sense? If you're ever unsure about how strong a country's economy is, let's look at Italy. We can see Ferraris, Fiats, Maseratis, Ferrero Rochers. We can see all sorts of fashion lines. These are the vestiges of complex products that are exported to this country. Does that make sense? South Korea's got Samsung, and it's got all sorts of other industrial powers, Hyundais and the like. Kia is another example. These are all highly complex products. Complexity speaks to the value that you add into the product before you sell it to somebody else. So this is where the desire for beneficiation comes from. Everyone goes, don't sell the raw materials. Take the iron ore, get out of the ground, make it into a part, take the part, make it into a car, make the car into a brand, take the brand, export the brand, and that's how you're going to make complex products. The implication there is there's lots of labor, lots of companies in that supply chain adding value in that country before they do a very critical thing. By swapping it for foreign currency, it maintains the purchasing power of that country's currency. The export link is vital, which is why when Thomas Sankara decides to go and secure his food production by generating wheat just for Burkina Faso, it doesn't give them the economic benefit, because exporting is where the purchasing power comes in. So, because there's time that's running out, one of the things that I'd encourage you to do is to look at the Atlas of Economic Complexity. This is an atlas which shows you just how complex the products are that people create and export. So if you look at the graph, you'll see that all of the blues will show you all of the remarkably complex things, medical equipment, bio-equipment, those types of things. If you look at the Angolan graph, you'll find that 96% of Angolan exports is crude oil. No complexity. There is no mistake. You can plot every single country by the complexity of its products and if they export them. So let's go back to our Zambia and South Korea example. Has everyone seen Hyundais? Yes. Kias? Yes. Samsung phones? Absolutely. How many Zambian products do we have in this room right now? This is exactly the point. So what we have got to do is we need to add complexity to our products, and we have to look to export markets. This is why I say there is no need for a change of economic policy. There is no need for a change in government. There is no need for a political party. I don't mind what you choose to do. You may pursue them. Those things are important. But I need you to know that sitting here today, right now, nothing precludes you today from adding to the complexity of your products and looking to export markets. So I run a digital marketing agency, and one of the things that we did is we used the Microsoft Connect Xbox to build a game for Yokohama Tires. It is a Japanese company that has an American head office in Santa Ana, California, the home of all things technology. In that environment, there is a Johannesburg-based firm selling gaming services in the center of Silicon Valley. Now, that complexity, that design plus game plus code plus programming plus gamification devices plus the export of that back to the US, is something that is as near to us as our noses to our face, every one of us. And nothing prevents us from doing so. In the end, we don't need the entire country to do so. The examples I cited from highly industrialized countries are large conglomerates which in the main drag the economy along because of their complexity and export power. I would like to convince you today, regardless of what you do and where you do it, that there are a handful of us that are required to pursue this end of complexity, to pursue the end of export markets, and we can drag this country, in spite of corruption, in spite of a lack of education, in spite of all these other hindrances, into the place where we know we belong, at the summit of global economic prosperity and success. So I'd like to leave you with this, that for our prosperity today, we have all that we need. The truth is we have much more than we need. What we need to do is that for social justice issues, don't stop being active. Pursue them to the extent that you need to. But don't make the mistake of conflating them with what drives economic prosperity. So I would like to recruit you today to the number of companies that are adding to the complexity of their products and that are looking to export them. If we do that, whatever is happening in the political sphere, whether we have a Silvio Berlusconi or not, we can at least have this discussion with the GDP per capita that looks like Italy's. Thank you.
Sure. What can South Africans do to build a better future? A whole range of things, and I've devoted a lot of my life kind of thinking about that question. I think at the essence of it is that we've got to make sure that we can align what it is that we have with how we see the world. I think what's important is that, you know, if you look at people, there's kind of practical people. They know how to get what they want. But you've also got people who know what people ought to want. And I think we kind of need to marry those two so that people, you know how to get what they ought to want. And that's in essence what we need to do in South Africa. We're incredibly blessed, incredible resources, people, place, technology, all of these things. But sometimes how we look at it is a little jaded. So sometimes I kind of liken it to someone who's colorblind. If a car is red and you see purple, it doesn't change the fact that the car is red. What we need to do is adjust our lens so that we can actually see it for what it is. That it's a place of amazing opportunity, that everything we need we have right now. We don't need new policies, we don't need new political parties, we don't need new presidents. Those things are important and we'll get new ones all the time, but we've got everything right now we need to succeed. And I think that's what we need to change. Why is Finance Indaba a great platform for finance professionals? A couple of things. A lot of the work that I do is in the technological space. And I'm seeing a lot of innovation and a lot of problem solving that's marrying the worlds of technology and finance. And that's an incredibly important thing because it's greater efficiency and also it's a greater way to actually go after the opportunities that we have. And I think the marrying of those two things gives us exciting possibilities. And I think every finance professional should be looking in some way to be more efficient and to be able to go after new opportunities. And I think that this is a melting pot that gives you that ability. I think the conversation as well that goes around that in the various thought leadership sessions and all the people that are speaking give you a very good context about where and how you should be applying these innovations. So for that reason, I think it brings those vital ingredients together, and I think it's a fantastic platform.